Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Manning. I am the board chair of the Democratic Majority for Israel. And as people continue to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for this DMFI live briefing to discuss Prime Minister Netanyahu's trip to D.C., where negotiations stand with Hamas, and the latest news out of Iran and the Middle East. Over the past few eventful weeks, DMFI has been hard at work. We've sent briefing materials and talking points to Democrats on Capitol Hill. We've spoken to the press. We have lifted up our Democratic allies on social media, conveying the vital message that Israel has the right to defend itself and that ending the Iranian nuclear program unequivocally makes the world a safer place. Before we get started, I want to remind you of a few details. First, I hope you'll consider following us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website at dmfi.org. If you want to ask questions during today's briefing, you can submit those questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. Or if you're watching on social media, feel free to post your questions in the comments and we'll try our best to get to them during the Q&A, which will be moderated by the DMFI President and CEO, Brian Romick. So let me go ahead. I'm very excited to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers for today. Lazer Berman is the diplomatic correspondent at the Times of Israel, where he also reports on Christian affairs. His career spans journalism, national security, and Middle East policy, having served as a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a researcher at the Israeli Defense Forces Dados Center for Interdisciplinary Military Studies, and as the Foreign and Defense Policy Research Program Manager at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a reserve captain in the IDF's 89th Commando Brigade, having previously served in the Bedouin Reconnaissance Battalion. Ambassador Daniel Shapiro is currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was U.S. Ambassador to Israel in the Obama administration, and he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Biden administration. Dan has held several senior policy positions in the State Department, at the National Security Council, and in Congress. He was Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council from 2009 to 2011, and was Director for Legislative Affairs at the National Security Council from 1999 to 2001. Earlier in his career, he held senior positions with former Senators Bill Nelson and Dianne Feinstein on Capitol Hill. And last but certainly not least, retired former IDF Colonel Miri Eisin is an internationally recognized expert on intelligence, security, and the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. She is also a senior fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. Over her 20-year career in the IDF, Colonel Eisin held groundbreaking roles in Israeli military intelligence, including serving as the intelligence officer of a regional border brigade, the head of the Syria Department in the IDF's Northern Command, and assistance to the Director of Military Intelligence, becoming the first woman to serve in many of these positions. She concluded her service as deputy head of the Combat Intelligence Corps. After retiring from the IDF, she served as the Israeli government spokesperson during the Second Lebanon War and as international press secretary to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert during the 2007 Annapolis Peace Conference. Lazer, as the Times of Israel diplomatic correspondent, you traveled with the Prime Minister on the state airplane Wing of Zion from Israel to D.C., along with just a handful of Israeli journalists. So why don't you start us off with a breakdown of the trip so far. Then we'll go to Ambassador Shapiro for his analysis as the former U.S. ambassador on what this trip means for U.S.-Israel relationship, and then to Colonel Eisin to discuss what it means for Iran, the broader Middle East, and a potential ceasefire with Hamas. Over to you, Lazer.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, DMFI, and thank you, Dan and Miri. Great honor to be with you today. So this is you know, the third time since Trump came back to office that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been here in Washington, has been in the White House, and has brought the Israeli diplomatic pool along. I think this time feels very different than the April trip. If you remember the April trip, which was the previous one, it was right before Passover, right before Pesach. Netanyahu was coming. We were in Budapest, in Hungary, for so a very kind of a softball trip. It was he was meeting with Orban. He had this honor guard in the Buda Castle. You know, these look like Austro-Hungarian cavalry. And then they had this three-way conversation with President Trump, and it seemed like kind of, you know, a kind of a victory lap. Here we have these kind of right-wing, quote unquote, anti-liberal leaders in the West, and they're kind of making this new alliance. Netanyahu decided to answer Trump's call and go to the White House, and the expectation was that it would really be solving this tariff issue and a couple other things, but it would be quite successful. And then, if you remember, in the Oval Office, there were three surprises that came out. Trump announced the direct Iran talks. He praised Erdogan of Turkey, obviously maybe the leading critic of Israel on the world stage. And he said that you know the tariffs are not going away anytime soon. So that was a very different field. I can tell you, you know, I sat with. There was a briefing after the first meeting with a very senior Israeli official who wears a red tie, and the whole, you know, all the other senior Israeli aides who were there, and the vibes, I guess is the word, the feeling, what they were telling us was just uniformly positive. I mean, there was some real energy there, telling us that we don't understand how different this president is compared to other presidents, and the level of coordination and understanding is just a different league. That's what they're saying. Again, they were saying this, you know, not in front of cameras. They were telling the reporters this. Obviously, you can make your judgments on that, but that was certainly the energy. This was, just to give a little bit of background, this was late at night. It was 11 p.m. You could certainly see that the senior Israeli officials were quite tired, but were energized by the potential for what is happening here. Now, there's a couple of big stories here, but obviously the biggest one that we're keeping track of is what's going on in the talks in Doha and how close we might be to a hostage deal. There have been plenty of times over the past more than a year where, you know, any sign of progress would cause all sorts of reports, I think a little bit irresponsibly, that we're about to come to a hostage deal, and that there was talk of this expectation that there would be an announcement maybe in the first meeting, and then when Netanyahu had that second meeting yesterday afternoon, which, by the way, we had no access to, that was because there was going to be an announcement. So I think we have to be a little bit realistic. The fundamental differences between Hamas and Israel remain. Israel is trying to get as many hostages out without committing to ending the war, and they're hoping that they can kind of trick Hamas. Hamas will think that they're entering this process that in which Israel will have their hands tied and won't be able to end the war, and they'll be able to get hostages out, maybe 10 living, maybe even more if they can extend it a little bit, and then whenever they need to, go back and achieve the war aims that Netanyahu has set throughout. And he continues to stress at every possible juncture that Hamas will not remain armed. It will not remain in any sort of ruling capacity in the Gaza Strip. That's the hope. Hamas understands it doesn't have, I'm sorry to call them assets, but it doesn't have many assets left except for the hostages. It really can't threaten Israel in any way. It can threaten Gazans, but that's not going to change the reality of the war. The way it changes the reality of the war is the fact that it has these hostages, and it's not going to. The fewer it has left, the harder it is to get them free. And it remembers what happened in the January to March ceasefire, where Israel went back to war in a pretty aggressive way. So it doesn't want to make that mistake again. So the two are at very different points right now, and that has not changed. At the same time, the feeling is we don't have to bridge that huge gap initially. We just have to get into some sort of ceasefire, and then the hope is that, you know, either we solve that or we don't solve that. But what's holding it up now is mostly the IDF withdrawal if there is going to be a ceasefire. If you remember, in March, at the start of this Gideon's Chariot operation, Israel established a new corridor running from Israel's border to the sea. You had, the Netzarim corridor further north. You have Philadelphia. North of Rafah, there was this Morad corridor named after one of the settlements from Gush Katif. Israel wants to stay there. You've heard talk from Defense Minister Katz of a new humanitarian city in the south. That the planning for that is really not well done yet. There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered about what that would look like and who's going to supply the aid and what happens if someone doesn't want to go. But Israel is insisting on staying there. Hamas obviously wants as much as a withdrawal as possible, and it seems like the U.S. Did not accept Israel's initial maps about where it wanted its troops to be, and therefore Israel is resubmitting maps which have a further withdrawal. So that is what's going on in the Doha talks. It's really that issue that's holding up real progress right now. But I think we should be somewhat cautious. One of the senior officials 2 nights ago said, even if Hamas had accepted the Qatari proposal, it would still take a couple more days to make this happen. So they did not accept that. So we still have to get to some agreed upon proposal and then talk about a lot of the details. So I don't think it's going to be imminent. At the same time, we don't have a return flight set with the prime minister. It was obviously supposed to be Thursday, kind of broadly. Now, as with every trip that he does, he stays over Shabbat. So now we're starting hearing more and more. We're starting to look into Shabbat. So we might be here longer, and that could be a sign that something really is starting to happen and there needs to be more discussion. So I do expect more meetings between Trump and Netanyahu. And I'll just very briefly say, there's also the question about what happens with Syria if there is an agreement in the offing. Certainly not going to be a normalization agreement at this point. They're looking for some sort of security arrangement. Obviously, Syria has no interest in fighting with Israel right now. They're just trying to get Israel to withdraw as much as possible and to stop striking in Syria. It's not clear that Israel would want that in and of itself, but if that leads to some broader process, which gets Israel into into this kind of the Western move to rehabilitate Syria and to start investing in it and to really pull it out of the pull it out of the jihadist spheres and really put it in the West with the Saudis, with some of the other pro-Western countries, then I think Israel would be very open to that, but it won't be the narrow security agreement only. So I'm going to stop there. And of course, in questions, we can go into some more of the details of what's happening. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Laser. Ambassador Shapiro, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Good to be with DMFI. Thanks for organizing this. Good to be with Laser and Miri as well. So obviously, anytime the Prime Minister of Israel comes to Washington for meetings with the president, it's important, an important kind of implementation opportunity and planning opportunity, really scoping out reviewing what has happened and scoping out the next phases of the things the countries are going to try to do together in the region and take advantage of various strategic opportunities. Always a good indicator of a close partnership, and that means it often means that there's been success that can be kind of marked and reviewed, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that they agree on everything, and that's fine. That's actually a perfectly normal thing that two leaders of different countries, even very close partners, will get together and work through things that they don't necessarily agree on for the way forward. Laser talked a lot about the discussions on Gaza, and I will come back to it, but let me start by commenting on what I think is probably the discussion around Iran, which is also very important. Obviously, the president and the prime minister would have had a chance to review the success of the Israeli and then the U.S. strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities and other Iranian targets as well from the Israeli side. And there's still a lot of work to be done. That's not to take away from the success of strikes that have clearly rendered many of the Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan unusable, and probably for a very significant period of time. And that's certainly to the good of putting time on the clock that would prevent Iran from the opportunity to create a nuclear weapon. But I think also there needs to be a continued sifting through the information, the intelligence, the other streams of information that will help give the most realistic assessment and battle damage assessment, as we call it, of exactly how far the program has been set back and what scenarios might unfold if Iran did decide that they were going to try to reconstitute this program. For example, we believe that Iran still has the highly enriched uranium, the 60% that it had before the strikes. Whether it has it in possession, whether it's spirited away to some other location, whether it's buried, but will ultimately be retrievable from sites that were damaged in the strikes. We don't know explicitly or all of those details, but clearly if they have that material, clearly if they have any ability to continue to manufacture centrifuges, they could reconstitute an enrichment capability, and there would be some possibility of them resuming that path. So this has to be monitored very, very closely. Similarly, on the weaponization side, although some of the important facilities they would use to build a weapon are not usable, but again, their ability to reconstitute that has to be monitored very, very closely. What I think this calls for, and what I'm quite certain has been a very important part of these discussions, even if not as publicly identified during the press conferences and the other briefings, is that there needs to really be a common approach for the United States and Israel around all aspects of this. First of all, the diplomacy. We've seen reports that Steve Witkoff is likely to meet with the Iranian foreign minister in Europe next week. I don't think the date has been set. It seems it's going to be in Oslo, Norway, but it's very likely that there will be a resumption of some kind of diplomacy with Iran. Now, before the strikes began earlier in June, and the U.S. and Iran were negotiating, the United States had landed, it took a little while, but had landed on a position of no enrichment as the goal, that ensure that Iran does not have that capability to produce the enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. My judgment is that will still be the goal, and making sure the United States and Israel have as common a definition of what that goal is very important. And what comes with it, probably in any agreement with Iran, if Iran were to agree to that standard, which so far they've given no indication they will, but it would probably involve some sort of sanctions relief, because so many of the sanctions are tied to Iran's nuclear program. There are sanctions tied to other things Iran does as well, but it's impossible to imagine Iran just agreeing to give up their enrichment capability to zero enrichment and get nothing in return. So making sure the U.S. and Israel have some sort of common understanding about how that would unfold is important. Obviously, there are other sanctions elements to this discussion as well. There is still a deadline in October, and functionally it's probably a bit earlier than that, for the triggering of the snapback sanctions. That is, the sanctions that were applied under that were repealed, rather, or suspended under the JCPOA in 2015, but members of the Security Council, members of the who continue to be members of the JCPOA, that's the European countries, France, Britain, and Germany, have the ability to trigger the return of those sanctions if Iran remains out of compliance with its JCPOA limitations as it is. So that is a tool of leverage, and making sure the United States, Israel, and hopefully those European partners are of one mind about how to deploy that tool of leverage is going to be very important. Getting the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, back into Iran. They've currently taken themselves out of Iran because of concerns for their safety, but ensuring they can return to inspect the sites, inspect the enriched uranium if it's found, make sure that their eyes are on the Iranian program to have full visibility of any efforts to reconstitute it. And of course, similar efforts need to be coordinated between the United States and Israel, and probably several other governments, about what our intelligence will produce in terms of understanding what Iran is doing with the program, if it's trying to take it underground, if it's trying to take it to covert or more opaque kinds of programs that other countries have pursued. That would obviously be a real challenge, because we might not have the same knowledge or visibility of the program as we had previously, but that's got to be well coordinated. And of course, the question of whether additional military action might be necessary if Iran did reconstitute and did try to move back to the same proximity to a nuclear weapon as it had before. Both the president and the prime minister separately have spoken about that possibility of additional military action if necessary. But that, again, should be very closely coordinated between the two of them. And finally, there's an important element even outside of the nuclear dimension, which is Iran's possible attempt to retaliate for the strikes it endured in asymmetric means, in deniable means, using their proxies, using terrorist attacks outside of Israel, outside of the Middle East even. Maybe we've even seen a little initial indication of this with the uptick of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea over the last few days, where they've sunk a ship and killed some mariners and taken, it appears, taken some hostages as well. So there's certainly the possibility of Iran continuing to try to retaliate for the strikes it endured, and that's going to require a very close U.S.-Israeli coordination for dealing with that. So I think that's very much happening, but it's a bit more in the background. On the Gaza question, it really relates in a lot of ways to whether or not Israel and the United States will be able to take advantage of a number of the strategic opportunities that this moment presents in the Middle East. The possibility of returning to discussions between Israel and Saudi Arabia or other Muslim and Arab nations on normalization. The possibility of some sort of security understandings, at least with Syria and Lebanon, maybe as precursor to future attempts at normalization there. And of course, the possibility to get the remaining hostages released and home to their families where they belong. This is, in some ways, I think, as Laser sort of suggested, still being fine-tuned in the negotiations in Doha and back here in Washington. Maybe the prime minister will extend. But it's not 100% clear, and this, maybe will emerge a little more in this discussion, if the prime minister and the president are fully aligned on exactly what that approach should be like. Of course, the president has said he really wants to see the war in Gaza come to an end. The prime minister has said, well, he wants to have the war end, but defines that only in terms of Hamas being fully removed from power, fully disarmed, fully expelled from Gaza. And of course, that's a very legitimate thing to try to achieve, given the attacks of October 7th. But it may be that in order to get all hostages out and in order to get Arab states to play a constructive role in the reconstruction of Gaza, in the exile of remaining Hamas elements, in the de-radicalization, in humanitarian efforts, that's going to be hard to do while Israel remains present militarily in Gaza. And there's even a debate within Israel about this, where the IDF has cautioned against measures that would sort of pull them into a full-scale and essentially permanent or semi-permanent anyway, military occupation of Gaza, and even having to militarily set up a military government. That relates to this humanitarian zone that Laser mentioned that is under discussion. So I'm not sure that there's a total alignment between the U.S. and the Israeli positions. And again, that's okay. It's fine for the United States and Israel to have disagreements. It's fine for them to try to work through those disagreements at the head of state level. The president has some leverage in these conversations if indeed he's trying to nudge the prime minister toward a more definitive end state to the war, to get all the hostages out, to spare the loss of additional soldiers. We've, of course, seen quite a number of Israeli soldiers killed in recent days, to spare additional Palestinian civilian casualties as well. The president, having come into the war with Iran and bombed the Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan facilities with the unique U.S. capability, certainly has a certain amount of leverage if he wants to bring it to bear in those conversations. The prime minister say, I need your help to really move us past partial deals, interim deals, deals that are going to leave behind hostages, deals that are going to pull Israel more deeply into a war that we really all want to see end. And so I think that is part may explain that second meeting yesterday, which there was no press access, that they still have things to talk through. They maybe are talking to them fully in private, which is fine. And it may be that even certain commitments that the prime minister might end up making to the president will remain private, and that's also fine. But that's the critical work that has to unfold in the days and hours and days ahead if we're going to see the hostages come home, as we all so much want to see. Why don't I stop there, Kathy?
Dan, can I just ask you one question before we go to Colonel Eisen? When you talked about the Iran negotiations, do you think there's any indication that the negotiations will go beyond the nuclear program and go to getting some agreement by Iran to stop fostering terrorism, to cut off relationships with its proxies? Any indication of that?
I think at the moment the negotiations are going to remain focused on the nuclear issue, but of course all of those concerns, their missile program, their proxy network, which of course is very weakened but still extant in some ways, and their broader international behavior are all relevant and would not allow a complete normalization, or sometimes the president has referred to kind of a total peace agreement with Iran. I don't see that as likely under this Iranian regime. And if it were to make all of those changes, it would really be a different Iranian regime. Even if miraculously it was the same people. Very hard to imagine this Ayatollah, this Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and other regime pillars agreeing to those changes. So those are going to need to be dealt with over time. But I think the immediate and most pressing requirement is to make sure the nuclear program is not reconstituted and they remain at a very safe distance from any attempt to achieve a nuclear weapon.
Okay, thank you for that. And on to Colonel Eisen. We're all anxious to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Laser and Dan. And I'm thinking, what in the world do I talk about now after what Laser did, after what Dan did? And so I'm going to try and tie some things together. And I'm sitting right now in Tel Aviv. And I'm saying that because I don't mean this in any way disrespectfully, but I'm not in the 51st state. Okay, I'm in Israel and I'm sitting here right now, and things sometimes look a little bit different when you're sitting on this side of the ocean. And obviously Laser's from here and Dan's been here forever. And so have you, have Kathy and everybody here, but it doesn't look the same from here. And I'm saying that right now because if I go online now and I look at what we're talking about right now with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington, it's a slightly different way of looking at it. One, everybody wants to know, and I'm using harsh words, if I want to say when, there is a hostage exchange, everybody here is talking about the selection process. So who are the 10 or 12 or 15 that will be chosen as opposed to the 10 or 5 or 8 who won't be chosen? And I say that because it's a very divisive issue inside Israel right now. And I don't think that the prime minister and the president talk about that. And yet in Israel, they're talking about that. Right now inside Israel, one of the biggest things that's happening has to do on two different aspects that are domestic, but they immediately tie in to everything we're talking about. One is that the IDF is sending out now, for the first time in a very long time, tens of thousands of draft notices to Haredi young men. That's a huge issue inside the state of Israel. And that directly has to do with the war. It has to do with the fact that 5 young men that were killed yesterday, I'm losing my sense of time, the day before, were from a Haredi unit. And inside Israel, it's that aspect. So are we together in this or not together in this? In the fight in the Gaza Strip against Hamas, in the hostages that are there and who's coming back? It's very personal inside Israel. And I think that here, one of those questions is that with President Trump, he's very personal. I say that in the sense of how Israelis feel him, in the sense that Idan Alexander, the one American, was brought back by the President of the United States. That's a feeling of that here. And here the joke in Israel is like, if you don't have an American passport, you're not going to be able to get back. It's a very harsh debate inside Israel between the hostages, those who are fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and the domestic issue. And I'm just adding in that under the radar, while everything else is going on, there's supposed to be a vote in the Israeli Knesset to oust an Israeli Knesset member, unheard of, unthought of, but it's something under the current, an Arab citizen of Israel who's a head of an Arab party in Israel. And all of that I'm putting in the background because I want to tie it to Iran and the region. Because at the end, the actions that Israel took, the United States of America is the United States of America, but the actions that Israel took, meaning 12 full days of air superiority that was continuous, that was done with a country that we don't border, including today that we also, yesterday and the day before, we again attacked the Houthis in Yemen and attacked different sites inside Yemen. That capability to have that kind of superiority over Iran, 1,000 miles away, 1,500 kilometers or more away, has changed dynamics in our arena. And I was up at the Lebanese border today, and I was looking onto the other side. And many of you have been up there with me in the past, and Lebanon has totally changed. And Lebanon now has a country that has a president and a prime minister. And they're not saying, and we love Israel. No, but they're saying, we're not going to allow Iran to come back in the way that they were there. And that is huge. So in Israel, they also want them to hug us and for us to be able to go eat hummus in Beirut. But I'm willing to take the win right now that there's a president, a prime minister, a chief of staff that are all stating there right clearly that they are trying to stop Iran from resupplying Hezbollah, and not just with the weapons, because they're being quite efficient, but also with money, meaning that if after the 2006 war, the main money flow into Lebanon came from Iran via Hezbollah to rebuild the destruction after the Second Lebanon War. Right now, the buckets, the suitcases, they're not managing. I'm sure that some gets through, okay? But Lebanon is trying to stop it. Lebanon, or at least some of Lebanon, is trying to stop that. That's a huge change. And when I was looking into it, I just want to remind everybody today, I mean, it's the new Muslim year. And in the new Muslim Hijri year, the first month on the 10th day, very parallel in that sense to the 10th day of the Jewish year, you have the Ashura day. And that it was at the beginning of the week, but for the last, I mean, I've been in this arena a long time, for the last 35 years, as far as I'm concerned, in the 10 days of the first 10 days of the month of Ashura, I get a look into Lebanon and all I see are red flags. Dan, do you remember the red flags? The flags of Ali that you're going to see? Okay. And that's what you're going to see inside Lebanon. And I saw one today. So everybody's going, oh my God, they have a flag. And I'm like, you do realize that for every single year that I've ever looked into that it's different. There's a different sense, and that's to Lebanon. And I add into that Syria because said before, I can't remember, I think it was Dan, that in that sense of, being against in that sense that this new regime, on the one hand, Iran, and the other hand, jihadi. This is something else completely. And I followed Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who I now got to call Ahmed Ashara, for many years as an absolute al-Qaeda jihadist. And I watched him in the first time that we saw him in front of the camera in 2016 on Al Jazeera as a Osama bin Laden lookalike jihadist. And I saw his transition not in December 2024, but from 2019 and 2020, 2021. And I didn't care as much because he was up in Idlib then. But I say that because these are two major earthquake changes that the attack against Iran and that air superiority against Iran, it ties back in. There are new things happening here. And our military prowess brought about an enormous change for Lebanon, brought about an even more enormous change for Syria. And I don't think that we right now, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'm going to use the terms, are cashing in on that diplomacy that both Dan and Laser were alluding to. Because that diplomacy is that new alliances are being held. And so I wonder if in that meeting yesterday, it's about that new alignment in the Middle East. And I think that the sticking point is still the issue of what is the next day as a term inside the Gaza Strip. That same government inside Israel that opposes the Haredi young men from being drafted at all, that same, and this is the government. We can't ignore it right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu comes with the government that he has. His party, the Likud party, in the last week put on the table a bill to apply Israeli law to Area C in Judea and Samaria. And I want us to be aware of these right now. And that's his party, Likud, not Ben Gvir or Smotrich. And so when you tie that together in that sense of, so what are we doing in the Gaza Strip? It's the hostages, and it's what happens in the Gaza Strip as a much bigger issue because it connects to Judea and Samaria. It connects to how do we look at a country like Syria, where there's this jihadi guy that I can send you all the photographs of what he looks like when he looks like Osama bin Laden. For God's sake, he was in US jails in Iraq, not in our jails. That he went and established an absolute al-Qaeda organization. And how can I ignore that in Syria? And look at him right now. And it's not about the suit and the tie, which are beautiful. It's about where is Syria going? And don't we want to be part of that? We border that. And that the continuation of that dialogue is that it's sidelining Iran. And I think that's the good news, but it's in the give and take, because to be able to bring us into the fold, I think, for the United States, for all of Europe that are rushing after Syria, for all of those who don't know why Europe is rushing after Syria, it's because there are so many Syrians in Europe. It's not because they're the good guys. There's like 800,000 just in Germany. And I put that back because it immediately becomes about a domestic issue. And for Israel right now to be able to get that Saudi aspect that Dan was talking about, to be able to expand, to me right now, there's actually a contention point that I'm not sure everybody is aware of, that our military prowess, on the one hand, wow, look at what it did, Lebanon and Syria. And the other side of that is that I think it is semi-freaking out the rest of the Middle East. Look at what we can do with our military prowess. And to translate that into something real, the give is not just in the Gaza Strip, because it's not just about the Gaza Strip. It kicks back in also to Judea and Samaria. So I put that on in there right now. I just got something else on my screen. I'm not sure where that came from right now. Lots of things going on the screen. I feel that in that sense that both Dan and Laser went through so clearly all of the other issues, that the only last point I want to make is about the Israeli military actions inside the Gaza Strip, where there's this combination inside Israel of that these young men now are being sacrificed. And I'm going to say militarily that I disagree, okay? That once you're in the Gaza Strip, and it doesn't matter if you're in a little or in a lot, you immediately are inside an arena which turns into a type of guerrilla warfare. And here, Laser, I just think that from a military point of view, absolutely the hostages are the Hamas's strategic asset, which is why they took 251 and why they trickle them out, because it's a strategic asset. But what they prepared before taking the hostages on October 7th as part of their plan, what they prepared decades in advance, was the subterranean and urban arena, because as soon as you pull us in, what they want to do is exactly these kind of IED arenas, booby-trapped arenas, pull us in, kill as many soldiers as they can wherever they can. And that they can do in the Gaza Strip much more successfully than inside Israel. So that for me, that's like, it's as if a given. And that doesn't mean I want people to die, but if we're going to be in there right now, it's going to be very difficult to avoid it without not doing any kind of engagement whatsoever and enlarging our capabilities there. And I don't want Hamas to be defining the rules of the game. So that the last point I'm going to make is that Iran is still trying to define the rules of the game as far as I'm concerned. They want to do this, they don't want to do that. They want to pose themselves right now as the victims, that we attacked civilians, that they're this, it's about a framing. And in that sense, I don't want Iran to redefine the rules of the game, not through their proxies and not through the nuclear capability. And I don't think that the prime minister right now, in that sense, when he's sitting there, that the give to be able to get the hostages is something that I don't think right now that this prime minister can give. And I'm putting it out to people here because I'm wondering what's going on in those rooms. I for the first time in my life, I'm sitting here and going, I hope President Trump really wants him to do that, and he can't say no to President Trump. Because I don't see our prime minister agreeing to that because of domestic issues at home. That was me.
Thank you so much, Miri. I have 20 questions I could ask you myself, but I am delighted to introduce our president and CEO, Brian Romick, who is going to bring our participants into the call through their questions. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you guys joining us today. I wanted to ask a question, I guess, for all three of you, since all of you touched on it in some way or another. Looking into your crystal ball, at the end of the year, what do each of you think the region's actually going to look like? Oh. Well, one of you guys wants to, I guess we should go in the order you guys spoke. So, Lazar, you want to go first?
Sure. So what are we in now? We're in July, so within 6 months. That's a tough question. I would imagine. Well, it's hard to say actually. If I had to put money on it, I would think that we have had another agreement in Gaza, one that fell apart and did not end the war, and that I would imagine we would be back to some sort of expanded operation and talks about the end of the war again. So I wouldn't imagine that we're in a very, very different place now, but hopefully with more hostages out. In terms of an agreement with Syria, I think that's quite possible that we'll have the beginning of that process of agreements that I talked about, at least the security side. And I think, we have to keep in mind that it could be that Israel does strike somewhere in Iran again, though, that's not necessarily a given, but it's possible. And I imagine the Houthis will still be firing once in a while as well. In Lebanon, you'll still see this push and pull between the government and Hezbollah trying to insist that it won't give up its weapons, and the government trying to assert some sort of its will, in limited ways. So I think it won't be drastically different, unfortunately. But I just want to stress that, it is very different now than it was looking back, certainly October 6th, certainly a year ago. And I think in general, the trends will be that we'll continue to deepen the gains that we've made and continue to reshape the region. I don't think we'll be there with the Saudis yet. I don't think we'll have normalized. We could normalize with another country, but I don't think it will be Syria or Saudi yet. So that's kind of my conservative guess what will happen the next 6 months.
I think Laser's forecast is a reasonable one. I must say, I think a lot depends on whether or not this agreement that they're working on to get to finalize the release of 10 hostages and a 60-day ceasefire really is the beginning of the end of the war or not. I think that's what President Trump wants it to be. That essentially it's a two-step. It's really the end of the war, but it's 60 days, and then 60 days would be extended during additional negotiations until some outcome is achieved and the fighting does not actually resume. I think that's what President Trump wants. And if that is possible, it's possible to imagine all hostages being home, both the living and the deceased, with their families before the end of the year. It's possible to imagine the beginnings of a cooperative effort between Israel and Arab states to exfiltrate or exile the remaining Hamas elements, leaders and fighters in Gaza to distant locations. It's possible to imagine the beginnings of a reconstruction effort in Gaza supported by Gulf states with the cooperation of Palestinian elements, leaders, and Gaza residents who want to live peacefully alongside Israel. And it's certainly possible in that context to imagine several of these other regional opportunities really being advanced, whether it's to full normalization with Saudi Arabia or not, maybe not, but certainly the prospect of that getting closer and the discussions getting deeper, and I think a better atmosphere for Syria and Lebanon opportunities, even if again they're short of full normalization, some sort of deconfliction or non-belligerency. That's I think most positive trajectory we could find ourselves on. However, if
let me do the non-positive one.
Just in one sentence, and I'll let you build on it, Miri. If 60 days is achieved, but then we're right back to where we were, more fighting, the IDF continuing to advance deeper into Gaza, essentially setting up a military occupation or a military government, which the chief of staff has cautioned the cabinet is the likely and maybe necessary state of affairs in that situation. I worry that we're going to see a war that will just persist and drag on, that a war that will cost the lives of the remaining hostages, cost the lives of many more Israeli soldiers, cost the lives of many more Palestinian civilians, cost additional reputational damage to Israel, and really not provide the necessary regional environment to allow some of those other strategic opportunities to really be maximized. So I think this is a very critical pivot point. And when the president says he wants to end the war, I think that's what he's talking about, is that first scenario and everything that comes with it, rather than the second scenario. Over to you, Miri.
So I'm going to take what you said, and I'm going to use for a moment, I kind of want to do this with an Israeli accent so that you all realize I am talking as an Israeli, and I'm saying it in that sort of way. President Trump said that you guys are not at war with the Houthis anymore, and I'm like, yay, but the Houthis can still fire at us. And absolutely attacked the 3 nuclear sites that are so core, and for 12 days we attacked hundreds, if not thousands, of sites inside Iran, and the 12 days inside Israel of the Iranian missiles coming in here were not the same as anything else of certainly the 21 months of war. And it's not something that just goes by. And I'm saying that because I worry about that term of saying, I want to bring peace. What does that mean? Because if it means bringing back 10 hostages, then to me, we are in for a very long, dark time period. Because if I'm Hamas, I try to prolong this as long as possible. And I'm going to ask, who is pressuring Hamas? We're pressuring Hamas with military capabilities. The entire world hates us right now because of that. But we're pressuring Hamas. We really are pressuring Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, and with a horrible price to people and to Palestinians and to children inside the Gaza Strip. Who else is pressuring Hamas? And so saying I want a peace and I want it to do and sending people and going to Qatar and I'm like, at the end, who's going to pressure Hamas? And I am very pessimistic. I think that right now, nobody is pressuring Hamas. And that even when you're talking to Hamas in Qatar or some of the Hamas that are in Turkey, but it's not the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, that the only one that's actually pressuring them is our military action. And I hate that. I hate what I just said right now. I don't want the military action, but it's the only thing that's pressuring Hamas. So when I look in my sad crystal ball, we are in way worse shape than what you just presented right now, because I don't see how we get out of this loop. And the worst part for me is that if the president of the United States says, I want peace and I want it to end, and he says it's ended, just like he said it's ended with the Houthis, and just like he said that we destroyed the 3 nuclear sites, and we could have a whole discussion about that. I'm very worried about that, meaning on that end of it. That was me being very, very overt Israeli in a harsh way.
No, that's a fair answer. We're kind of closing in on time here. I have 2 questions from the chat. Maybe people can answer both of them together. You guys touched a little bit on the Houthis, and Israel's managed to deal with Lebanon, deal with Iran. Like, why have they not been able to deal with the Houthis? One. And my other question from the chat, there was this report about the clans in Hebron wanting separate peace. There's talk of the clans in Gaza somehow playing a leadership role moving forward. So can you guys also talk about the clans and what role they play and what role they could play moving forward?
I'll start with the Houthis and leave the clans to other people, but with the Houthis. So there is a challenge. Have you all noticed that we haven't been that, I'm being very sarcastic right now, and I apologize, I shouldn't, but we haven't been very successful militarily against Hamas, and they're right next to us, and they're within, it's not easy. The Houthis, the Saudis for years tried to destroy them, didn't destroy them. The war itself inside there, they were supplied by Iran. They're far away. It's both distance, capability, and where you put your efforts. Israel put its efforts when it came to our threats and the threat assessment, both against the Hezbollah and Syria to a large degree, and Iran. And I would say that militarily we were very efficient and effective. And we weren't looking as much at Hamas in the right way. And here we are 21 months later. And to me, with the Houthis, it's about, do we want to put in all of that effort right now? Is the Houthis an Israeli problem? And the Houthis would love it that it's about an Israeli problem, just like Hamas is just an Israeli problem, or Hezbollah is just an Israeli problem, or for that matter, Iran is only an Israeli problem. So it's about where you put your capabilities, your intelligence, your operational sense. You have to put in effort to be able to have things like that. We're putting in effort. We're not doing it at all, but we have a lot of other things that are also on the list of immediate threats that are on our borders, around our borders, within. This isn't on the other side of the world. And for us, the Houthis are very far away. And I'll just add that the intelligence community has announced now that they are going to have a special program for 10th, 11th, 12th graders, not just for Arabic, but specifically for Yemenite Arabic. So obviously we're looking at this long term into something that we're going to have to address.
Well, why don't I pick up on the Houthi discussion? When President Trump suspended U.S. operations against the Houthis in April, and did that without an agreement from the Houthis to stop attacking Israel, which they've continued to do, The essential agreement, it was even agreement, was that they wouldn't attack U.S. ships, which is obviously very important. We've had many attacks against U.S. naval vessels during the past year and a half in the Red Sea. But there was at least a hope that there would be also a suspension of Yemeni attacks against commercial shipping as well. Well, that has resumed, and it's resumed in a rather brutal way this week, with a ship sunk, several mariners killed, several taken hostage. And this takes us back to where the Houthi behavior of a year ago and even longer. And the administration has to decide whether freedom of navigation, which has been declared a critical national security interest by multiple administrations. It was by the Biden administration. It certainly has been by the Trump administration, both first and second, is something that they're prepared to act to uphold. This precedent of allowing a terrorist organization sitting on a maritime choke point to simply be able, at a time of their choosing, based on capabilities they've been able to amass, to shut down legitimate commercial shipping in those waterways is very serious. It won't be limited to only taking place at the Bab el-Mandeb at the Red Sea. If this becomes a normalized behavior, there are other groups, whether they'll be armed by Iran or whether they'll have their own sources of weapons in other parts of the world and other maritime choke points that could do the same. So this is very serious that this be shut down, and it may require, or there may be a call for additional U.S. action, because this is, while the Houthis say this is about they're upset about the war in Gaza, and indeed it may be true that if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, some of the Houthi outrages will calm down. This is not something that can be sustained. So that does require the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, maybe the Emirates and some of the other Gulf states, getting back together and having a coordinated whole of government strategy. It's not just something with military tools. There are intelligence tools, there are sanctions tools, there's public condemnations, there's drawing attention to the fact that the Houthi actions create great hardship for their own people and for the peoples of other, in some cases, very poor and very war-torn nations along the Red Sea coast as well. So this can't be just U.S., but it also isn't something that should be just left to Israel. It should be a multilateral and multi-vectored kind of effort to ensure that this type of behavior by the Houthis themselves, or what it might inspire elsewhere, really is shut down. On the clans, I'm much less, I think, useful to offer. I'm very skeptical that the particular figure from Hebron who stated interest in joining the Abraham Accords and having an Emirate of Hebron has any significant legitimacy or influence in the Palestinian community in Hebron or more broadly in the West Bank. It's possible that clan elements in Gaza could be part of the solution of putting some leverage on Hamas and bringing in aid into areas that Hamas does not control. But that's at best a sort of a band-aid solution, I think, to the broader political solutions that are required in these cases.
I'll just
Laser,
quickly say, for the Houthis, no one would be paying attention to them if they weren't attacking Israel. So I think this, in the way they see it, this is great. They're the last ones left in the fight, quote unquote, supporting Hamas. Hezbollah, big powerful Hezbollah, is out. Iran's not doing anything. The Shiite militias aren't doing anything. So I think, the way they see it, we're able to distract how terrible things are for civilians in Yemen, and we are the stars of this anti-Israel world, and we're the ones who are continuing the fight. I think it'll ultimately, you'll need some sort of ground element to get them out, whether it's going to be Saudi backed or something like that, but it's not something Israel is going to be to do. Probably the Saudis and the Emiratis are saying to the West, remember, we were close a few years ago. You probably shouldn't have stopped us. But I think it'll have to be some sort of return to that if the Houthis are going to be uprooted, or at least really stop threatening shipping and threatening Israel. In terms of the clan, yeah, I agree with Dan that's kind of an outlier figure who's meets with settlers all the time and doesn't have a lot of cred on the street. In general, clans, they're not really a dominant feature. I mean, they're somewhat relevant, but it's not really the dominant feature of Palestinian society in the West Bank anymore. In Gaza, I think it's wise for Israel to work with other groups that are able to do some of its work for it and to start to at least locally prop up some organizations or some gatherings or some groups that have some local legitimacy, so Israeli soldiers don't have to do some of these things. I think that's wise. I would imagine Israel's working with more groups than just the Abu Shabaab group. And the less that Israel and these groups say about it, probably the better. But I think that is a strategy that would make, or a method that would make some sense for Israel. And hopefully they are doing it, but don't expect that to be the answer, that the Palestinians are going to give up their national aspirations. It's just going to be a bunch of Emirates. I think that's kind of a pipe dream.
Thank you. So I wanted to close out our program here and thank Ambassador Shapiro, Colonel Eisen, and Lazar Berman for taking the time of their schedules to join us today from the Pentagon and DC and all the way in Tel Aviv. As many of you guys know, I've only been at DMFI for less than 2 months, and it certainly continues to be an eventful time. 2 anti-Semitic attacks in the United States, war with Iran, Netanyahu visits Washington, D.C. I think this call was important. I think some important takeaways. As Israel tries to make peace with its regional neighbors and bring its hostages home, it's our job to ensure that Democrats understand Israel has a right to defend itself. Iran cannot have nuclear weapon capability. People need to remember that Hamas started this conflict with Israel on October 7th and killed 1,200 people, deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. And true peace cannot be achieved while Hamas rules Gaza. And we need to continue to make sure Democrats and Americans understand that. Hamas needs to be disarmed, and they can't have a role governing Gaza going forward. And as Colonel Eisen said, we need to focus the government on that. So after this call, you're going to receive an action alert from DMFI asking you to write your Congress member and encourage them to encourage the Trump administration to use every tool possible to pressure Hamas into accepting the ceasefire and hostage deal put forth by Israel and agreed to by Israel. It only takes a few clicks and a couple minutes of your time. We would not be doing this work without your support. Your involvement with DMFI helps keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel and strengthens the U.S.-Israel relationship. We greatly appreciate it. If you have friends that you can recruit to support our work, if you've made a gift yet in 2025, we're going to put the QR code on the screen as we do at the end of all of our calls and encourage you to click on it and donate and help us continue to host these calls. So we look forward to having another one soon, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.